All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see all of you on this first Sunday of June. Believe it or not, happy summer. I'll encourage folks to find a seat so that we can get started, and we might have a few folks trickle in. I have heard that the parking lot is quite full. It's Senior Sunday over there at worship. Whether you are here for the very first time or attending Sunday school as you do every single Sunday, we're so glad to have you with us. And we're also glad to have folks with us on Zoom. Thank you for being with us. We have a wonderful hour ahead, and I'd like to open us with a word of prayer. Would you please join me? Gracious God, we give you thanks this day for the unique splendor of your creation and for the unique splendor of those you have created. You've created each of us in your image, called us all by name, wrapped us in your love, and equipped us with various gifts and talents, desires and hopes. As we come together this morning, we pray that this would be an hour in which we grow in our understanding of how beautifully you've created us, and that we'd be encouraged to extend Christ-like love and compassion in radically hospitable ways. Thank you for the many guests who have joined us today to share with expertise and experience. And thank you for hovering over us all. Through Christ we pray. Amen. Well, friends, I am glad to introduce to you our speaker this morning, the Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Henson Hasty, who is familiar to a few of you. Dr. Henson Hasty was with us in January, and we're delighted to welcome her back to Covenant. The Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Henson Hasty is Professor of Theology and Ethics at Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Charlotte, and she is a minister member of the Charlotte Presbytery. She serves the church in a number of ways through preaching and teaching, through advocacy work, in addition to her commitment to ecumenical and interfaith dialogue. Her research explores themes such as Christian economic ethics, women and the social gospel, and religious freedom, among other themes. She joins us today to speak on disability theology, a field of study that explores how the Christian faith relates to the experiences of people with disabilities. It is a field that challenges ableism and seeks to make clear that the image of God is embodied and held within all people and within all bodies. We're so glad to learn with you this morning. Thank you for being with us. Following her presentation and lecture, we have the privilege of hearing from our inclusion team, who has been working hard the past several months at Covenant to establish meaningful infrastructure here to support people and families with disabilities. And we will have a very brief time, maybe, for question and response at the end of all of this wonderful presentation. So I hope you'll write down your questions for that time. So without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Henson Hasty.
What a gift to be with you here at Covenant again today, and also with folks who are online, to have an opportunity to be in conversation about the experience of people with disabilities in our society and also in the church. For me, this is part of my personal story. So I want to step away from the lectern for a bit and share some of my own experiences as I introduce some of the themes of disability theology and its importance, I think, for the church and our society. As I begin, I want to also name that I'm standing in front of a group of people. There is a PowerPoint on the right above my shoulder. I'm wearing a black dress, and my face is more square than round. My hair is reddish brown, and I'm wearing glasses that are tortoise colored. I want to begin our conversation today by situating myself in this discussion of disability justice, and also a conversation about caregiving. And I'll mention here as I start that even framing the conversation by underscoring caregiving for some people will be difficult to hear. So, I want to tell you a little bit about my own experience and how I became interested in disability theologies, and invite you just to take a mental note as you're listening to situate yourself also in this conversation and to consider perhaps two snapshots of your own life and experience that inform your understanding of disability justice and your accompaniment with people with disabilities. The first part of my own journey, I taught for 3 years at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College, which I'm very sad to say recently closed. It was an absolute wonderful school, and I understand that Covenant Presbyterian Church had a role in founding that school and also a role in establishing the Warner Hall Chair in Religious Studies, which one of my colleagues held while I was teaching there. St. Andrews was founded with a vision, and it was a vision that students talked about as building relationships between wheelies and walkies. There were students with disabilities who lived together in community with able-bodied students, and the campus was, at least in the 1960s, completely accessible. It had an incredible kind of meaningful ministry to provide college education that also transformed the way in which able-bodied people and people with disabilities lived in community together. Second snapshot that I want to offer from my own story relates to the book that you see on the screen that I entitled Dutiful Love. And it really is a story about the experience of individuals and families who are encountering serious mental illness. When my mother died 8 years ago, I took on some more responsibilities to care for my brother, who has serious mental illness. And I will say that I have permission from him to tell that part of my story. The experience of working with my brother and also having to help him find housing, make sure some basic needs were met, other things after the death of my mother, and also providing care for my father, who was elderly at the time and needed to find housing in a senior living center, was a kind of surprise to me. There was an 8-year-long waiting list for public housing. There were challenges, the need to get disability lawyers to be able to have SSDI, access to just basic support that a family member needed to simply survive. As a sibling, I became a caregiver. And I mentioned for some, this is a controversial term. But I find it important to really emphasize that particular relationship and also friendship that I have with my brother, because it is often invisible in the stories of families and invisible in the stories of congregations, what that means to take on the responsibility. Only 22% of siblings do so because it becomes difficult. When I was working on the book Dutiful Love, I interviewed siblings of people who were experiencing serious mental illness. And as I was conducting these interviews, part of the importance of them was finding people who I could walk with along my own journey. And I've continued to be in relationship with many of the siblings who I interviewed. I'll reference some of their stories, and particularly the theology that emerged out of that book and why it continues to be important to me today. Rabbi Julia Watts Belzer, you see her image here on the screen. She's a scholar and an advocate for disability justice. Her book, Loving Our Bones, recently won the prestigious Grawemeyer Award, one of the most prestigious awards in religious studies. In the book and her presentations, She speaks about and emphasizes wanting the world to embrace her disability because it is central to who she is. It's simply part of her experience. The experience of disability is a norm, it is not an anomaly. Worldwide, 1.3 billion people experience significant disability. That is 1 in 6, or 16% of the population. Over 61 million US adults, or 1 in 4, report having a disability. That number is higher among adults over 65, 2 in 5 people. People with disabilities are more likely to experience depression and health inequities due to unjust social expectations and social conditions. Thinking more specifically about mental illness, before the pandemic, 1 in 4 US American adults had been diagnosed with serious mental illness. Since the pandemic, NAMI reports that calls about anxiety and depression replaced schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Mental health has become complex today. The COVID-19 pandemic increased isolating loneliness, depression, and anxiety. There's also been a rise in PTSD and substance abuse, and an increase in fear and anger. Do you know how many adolescents have symptoms of a mental health disorder today? Any idea what percentage? 49.5%, nearly 50%, half of adolescents have symptoms of a mental health disorder. It's important here to recognize that in naming some of these experiences and the fact that disability is a norm and not an anomaly, that people with disabilities are all too often described as invisible congregants, their experiences and stories remaining untouched and untold. Within the context of serious mental illness, 92% of pastors reported talking about mental health once a year, rarely or never. And I'll mention an interesting thing in some of my own work on families experiencing serious mental illness, that evangelical research organizations, they are the ones that are really investigating the circumstance in the church. And I think particularly for mainline congregations and denominations, this is some very important work to become involved in, to provide a different kind of approach and witness. It's also a critical time for us to frame the right questions. And one of the most important questions that we might ask with regard to the experience of people with disabilities is whether or not we really know what disability is. It's a term that's applied to various complex circumstances that people confront in their lives. Institutions and organizations will often use the term disability to determine how to meet specific needs through programs or to name specific conditions on the basis of what disability justice scholars will call the medical model. And I'll just direct your attention to the definitions of these different models of disability on the screen. I'll say more in a moment about what the medical model is. But it's important to recognize that disability justice advocates and disability theologians emphasize that there are a variety of models of disability. Deborah Creamer, who now works for ATS, the Association of Theological Schools, offers 4 in her chapter on disability ethics and liberative ethics. The moral model that associates one's ability status to be either good or bad, perhaps the result of particular behaviors. The medical model, where attention is focused on what one can or cannot do and regards disability from a clinical perspective. The social model, known as the minority or political model, and how disability impacts a person's physical, social, cultural, and educational context. And then she also argues for what she calls the limits model, which breaks down some sense of false distinctions between non disability and disability. We're all on a spectrum of ability, right? That changes throughout the course of our lives. The limits model emphasizes that important aspect of what it means to live with a disability within particular spaces and within particular places, and how we define that in terms of creating community. What's also critical to recognize is that disability itself is a social construct, a word that creates a specific world to and for people to inhabit, and often one in which bodies that are labeled disabled are minoritized and marginalized. These bodies are compared to the dominant culture's idea of the ideal body and mind: tall, forward facing, able to ambulate with the ease of being on foot and without assistive devices. Some bodies assume cultural capital in this way. Others become subjected to what disability theologians and justice advocates will describe as the social process of disablement. They experience being othered in society, being seen as deviant or different. And many of our systems and structures reinforce that idea. To draw upon Krista Tippett's phrase, words make worlds. I also want to emphasize here that when we think about the way in which we understand people's ability and their own bodies, our concept of God is closely tied to the way we understand human beings. So, our theological language, the language that we use to describe God, our practice, our rituals, and our beliefs need to shift. For example, Augustine, his theological anthropology, offered an account of the perfection of the body and mind and an understanding of the resurrection of the body in which all infirmity is healed. Part of his understanding of what made human beings superior to animals was an emphasis on the rational, the ability of human beings to reason, and the presence of a soul. And I'll mention that later Augustine's ideas and theologies also related to his ideas connected to particular Christian practices. For example, in the Roman Catholic Church, there was a historic policy that became part of some of my interviews of siblings, where people who had committed suicide, perhaps the result of wrestling with serious mental illness, could not be buried in a Christian cemetery or a cemetery of the church. So the consequence of that was to create silence within the family, not talking about the struggle of the person or the issues that needed to be addressed. Challenging these kind of theological ideas and the practices that relate to them is why I titled this presentation God on Wheels. It's a reference to a vision in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 21. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of living creatures was on wheels. Julia Watts Belzer uses this image as a different way of thinking about God that also helps us to envision disability as divine encounter. One of the things I'd like for us to entertain together, and as we hear more from the inclusion team, is the goal of disability theologies and disability justice advocacy, which is to disentangle ourselves from systems, rituals, and beliefs that claim a hierarchy of minds and bodies. This requires a cultural shift. It requires more than a program, not just a programmatic response, but touching on everything, even the way in which we conceive of or name or describe what disability is. On this next slide, you'll see some partners in the work in which you're being engaged, some guides, so to speak. And I want to briefly describe each of these texts that have been recently produced. The first one, written by Jay Dolmage, it's called Disability Rhetoric. And in Disability Rhetoric, he emphasizes the need not only to transform our contemporary language, but also to consider whether or not we really understand in the past the nature of disability and its meaning in ancient cultures. That perhaps we have been reading those texts through an ableist lens. And if we start to transform our understanding, that it also might provide a different kind of ground, fertile theological ground, for the church to transform its ministries. Another guide that you see here is Amy Kinney. The title of her book, My Body Is Not Your Prayer Request, also talks about the way in which we name disabilities in public, and she struggles with language, whether or not we should use people first language, as I've used thus far in my presentation, people with disabilities, or for her, she wants to claim, and she names herself, describes herself as a disabled woman, because she wants to reinterpret that as a source of power and empowerment for her own relationships and her own work in a disability justice center. And she also sees assistive devices, such as her wheelchair, as liberative devices. They don't represent a kind of sense of suffering or struggle, but rather it's the way in which that she is able to move around quickly and freely. It's a fabulous book, and it might be one that you would want to consider. You also see on this screen Laura McGregor, and she's an important scholar and pastor to encounter because she's writing out of the experience of being a maternal caregiver and the challenge that she confronted in when in church congregations, she would hear theodicies or responses to questions about God's justice in the face of human suffering and struggle. She saw many of the theodicies emphasizing primarily a sense of goodness and a kind of easy way to ameliorate or to create some kind of sense of ease in the midst of the circumstances she was facing. For her, she gets into a kind of difficult space of really being honest about the burden of care within a social system that places the primary burden on individuals, the financial burden, time, and it impacted all of her career. And she's very honest about that. I also mentioned here Monica Coleman. This book, Bipolar Faith, is her own story of struggling with depression. As a womanist and also a process theologian, she integrates science throughout the book and really writes in a very self-disclosive way about what became liberating for her in talking about her experience of being bipolar realistically with congregations and um, thinking through the impact of womanist theology on those ideas. All of these scholars, and I'd already mentioned to you Rabbi Julia Watts Belzer, are trying to confront theologies, attitudes, and practices that make people with disabilities feel like the divine is absent from their lives. And they're trying to create a cultural shift. They emphasize developing and practicing innovative and contextually inspired rituals. For example, in some congregations, there will be an inventory conducted, not just to think about programs that provide accessibility, but also to study the space and the places and the people uh, with whom people with disabilities engage. So, in other words, to try to understand and create new and innovative rituals that emerge from the experience of people with disabilities in congregational contexts. Or I might add, they're caregivers. So, one of the biggest needs of caregivers is respite care, an opportunity, to have some kind of sense of support. They also engage in constructive theological imagination. In, I think, the next slide, or perhaps the one after that, it's going to describe or reference Julia Watts Belzer's image of God, not just a God on wheels, but also she talks about a God of 1,000 faces and how we might encounter not just people being created in the Imago Dei, but people being created in the Imaginus Dei, the images of God, and how that might shift our way of considering disability as divine encounter and drawing upon the experience of people with disabilities to describe that. They use empowering language, such as people first language, or what I referenced from Amy Kinney, claiming disabled as an empowering term. They build consensus and shared partnership, and really raise the question and invite us to raise the question of how people with disabilities are mentors for us in this journey of creating cultural change and change within congregations. They also emphasize moving beyond inclusion toward belonging. This is kind of an important shift because for some scholars, such as John Swinton, who is a theologian of disability theology, and he's also a psychiatric nurse, he will emphasize that inclusion operates on a kind of thin description of human beings. And at the same time, it invites and can maintain the social superiority of a dominant group. Whereas belonging is defined by people with disabilities themselves. I would highlight here the work of another important scholar who is in education. He teaches at Peabody School of Education. And he has articulated 10 dimensions of belonging to consider. And one of the most important of these dimensions is being present and being missed when one is not there. The 10 dimensions that you see here on the screen, he discovered through interviews of over 2,000 people who had intellectual disabilities, represented a wide variety of neurodiversity. And this is how they named the dimensions of belonging that they longed for within schools, within churches, within other settings. To be loved, to be present, to be invited, to be welcomed, to be known, to be accepted, to be supported, to be cared for, to be befriended, and to be needed. We can talk more about those dimensions after we hear from the inclusivity team, but I find the way in which he articulates these dimensions to be incredibly powerful. And in my book, Dutiful Love, I used these dimensions and then applied them within the context specifically of serious mental illness. So that would be another way to draw upon Eric Carter's model. Julia Watts Belzer, as she reflects upon the image of God that emerges from her own experience as a woman with disabilities, this is what she says. My God is a God of 1,000 faces. In classical Jewish midrash, the personal is a relationship that unfolds face after face. Each of us who glimpses God receives a knowledge of divinity that is unique and irreplaceable. God is like a mirror, another midrash teaches. The mirror never changes, but everyone who looks at it sees a different face. If the impersonal God is as vast and expansive as the ocean, then the personal face of God is a wave, rising up, rising up through the brief, brilliant arc of a particular life before it touches sand and shore and is drawn back into the sea. So I want to leave us with a question. And the question is, how can we, in our teaching, in our rituals, and in our theological reflection, continue to capture that brief, brilliant arc of everyone's particular life?
Thank you so much, Dr. Henson Hasty. At this time, we will, I think, have time for some questions. So I hope you will jot those down, and Don's going to help me collect those toward the end of this program. But I'd like to now invite our inclusion team forward to join us for a little bit of conversation. Well, thank you all so much for being with us today. Let's just start by having you introduce yourselves and how participating in the inclusion team has been for you. Michelle, would you start us off?
So my name is Michelle Beatty. I've been a member of Covenant for about 9 years, and I have 3 children, an 8-year-old son, and 6-year-old twins, a boy and a girl, who have developmental disabilities, specifically autism. And so being a part of this group has been just a real passion project for me. I'm very excited for the vision of the group and what we have planned for kids in our church. Yeah.
My name's Amanda Shanks. I have served the last year here at Covenant as the intern for Christian education. And this team emerged out of many conversations that I had with Grace Linval. My 9-year-old daughter, Taylor, has a very rare genetic condition called Pura syndrome. And so when I was searching for an internship site, a big part was finding a place that could love my daughter, accept my daughter, and accommodate my daughter. And Covenant's done a beautiful job with that. We set up a buddy program, which was the first time Covenant's done that for a child here. And it really fostered a lot of great conversations and then, lots of connections with everyone in this group. So it's been really wonderful.
My name is Sarah Hoover. I have 2 kids. I've got a 2.5-year-old Lila and a 6.5-year-old Will, who is in the Autism Brain Club, is what we call it in our family. I came into this group and, like Amanda said, made wonderful connections, and I'm excited to expand the supports we have at Covenant for other families like ours.
Good morning. I have an adult daughter, Rebecca, with a very rare genetic disorder. I've already walked the journey of many families impacted by a disability not feeling included in church. I was honored to be asked to be on this inclusion committee to help every family impacted by a disability feel like they belong here at Covenant. Our children will grow up, but most will still need support as an adult. So my vision is to see our children's program grow with our children into adulthood and that they know they have a place where they belong at Covenant.
My name is Roberta Fox. I have 3 children. My 12-year-old daughter has mild cerebral palsy. And I think every stage in parenting so far has had some challenges, but for me, those sort of preschool, early elementary years were the hardest because she was not able to advocate for what she needed or what she needed to be safe in an environment. And so I am really excited to be part of this committee and just this church community that wants to continue to welcome all abilities and not just welcome, but make sure that we're prepared so that everyone who comes through our door can thrive.
I'm Jen Godwin. I have 3 kids, a 13-year-old and twin 8-year-old boys, and one of our twins has a genetic condition similar to autism. Um, and we've been members since they were born, actually before they were born here at Covenant. And I um, really wanted to be part of this team, not only for my son Cohen, but in my professional life, my entire life, I've only worked with children with autism. And so I've seen some of the struggles that their families had when I was working with them to support their family, and then seeing the struggles that my own son had with coming to church as well.
Thank you all. I have a couple questions for you guys. And Jen, I'd love for you to speak first, but we'll welcome anybody to chime in. So Jen, can you share a bit more about what the function of the inclusion team is?
Sure. So I'll just kind of start with a brief story. My son Cohen struggled to find success going to church, going to Sunday school. He often would cry. He would get sick before. And so I spent a lot of times with my other kids in Sunday school, and I would either walk the halls with Cohen, or I would just stay in the class and volunteer with him so that he could still be part of it. And so, one Sunday, Jessica and her husband Seth were the teachers in the class, and they said, like, hey, we've got this, like, just go to church. And I did. And it was one of the first times I'd ever left Cohen without someone that I felt like really knew him. And I came back and he had participated and made an art project and had played with the kids. And I think that is a day that I say that Cohen saw a little bit of Jesus, but a whole lot of love. And so I think what people don't see is that it wasn't just the impact or what that moment meant to Cohen, but it was to our whole family, and that he could be somewhere where he was fully accepted and loved. And I look at that just being an example to us about God's love and acceptance. So when I think about this team and when we came together, we had one goal in mind, which was to ensure that every child who learns differently and their parents feel supported and fully accepted when they walked through our doors. And I think about, God was about radical love and belonging, and not waiting for someone to be good enough or to fix themselves to be accepted. So this team has really spent a lot of time listening to churches that are doing this work well, meeting weekly, talking to families, and really preparing our hearts and minds for what we want this ministry to look like. So I'm excited for some of the other people to be able to talk to you about what we've envisioned for the children's ministry when we think about our inclusivity piece.
Thank you, Jen. Anybody else want to chime in on the function of the inclusion team before we move on? All right. Well, Sarah, I would love for you to share a little bit about the recommendations that your team has made for the immediate future. And I do believe we have your slides. I'll hand you this and you just press.
Oh, perfect. So after that initial listening and learning period, we started dreaming up what impactful solutions would look like for Covenant. And our goal has been to create meaningful infrastructure that expands accessibility, provides support to make church experiences more comfortable and less stressful for kids with disabilities and their families, and overall just build out an environment that moves beyond welcoming and acceptance into a place of expectancy. We want to say to these families, you're expected, you're planned for, you're provided for, you're welcome here, and you are joyfully invited to find deep belonging here. So we came up with lots of there we go. Lots of support strategies and broke them down into 3 initial phases. So I'm going to give a quick overview of these, but I'll stick around afterwards if you have any questions or want to hear any more, because it's going to be a lot of things I'd throw at you. These were mostly divided up into these phases based on complexity, but sometimes also accounting for church-wide events and seasons, and then prioritizing getting some initial supports out right away so that people could go ahead and start benefiting. So phase 1 is happening right now. It involves incorporating adaptive curriculum into Sunday school, updating classroom appearance, and adding elements of universal design to make classrooms more accessible and functional for kids with different abilities. An adaptive supply cart that's stocked with things like easy grasp markers, chair bands, wiggle seats, slant boards for writing, things like that. Visual schedules in the Sunday school spaces that provide transition support and a lot of comfort for kids with autism and related diagnoses. Then we move to phase 2, which will roll out over the summer and in early fall. And strategies in phase 2 are a lot of different variations of sensory supports. So we have these sensory support bags that you're welcome to look through afterwards that will be in each of the Sunday school classrooms for Sunday school teachers and kids to use. Then we'll also have these sensory support kits available for services and events that are kind of a mini version of what's in the bag. We have a table of sensory support tool options that will be outside the power up room for kids to be able to find what they might be needing at the moment. We also are going to have a dedicated sensory classroom space for kids that just need a little bit of a calmer Sunday school experience or just a break. And then we also are putting sensory spaces that we're calling calming corners in each of the Sunday school classrooms, as well as in some of the hallway nooks. Phase 2 also includes training for volunteers, as well as learning opportunities for the whole church community, like the book study taking place this summer. Then phase 3 is more of our complex solutions, as well as solutions for families with higher support needs. They include a dedicated sensory family space, supportive care events, connection events and community building, church-wide education and awareness events, and probably the strategy that we're most excited for, which is a buddy program that will connect kids with trained volunteer buddies for one-on-one support so they can more fully engage with everything going on at church. So it's really important to note, in addition to all of these 3 phases, this committee and this work is going to continue going forward. These goals will have ongoing focus and resources and energy. We want to be sure that the things we put in place work and that we stay responsive to the families that we're trying to serve. So that work's going to continue going forward, and we're excited to see it roll out.
Thank you, Sarah. It is so exciting to hear about what y'all are doing. I used to be a classroom teacher, and just seeing these efforts and tangible actions taking place is unbelievable. So thank you all for the work that you have done and that you are continuing to do. Michelle, I'd love to hear from you a little bit on how people can become involved in this ministry and what support you all need. So I think we're at the beginning and hoping that folks will get engaged. So tell us a little bit about what that might look like.
Sure. So just first of all, at the most basic level, please spread the word, tell people about what we're up to, what we're trying to do. The more people who know about it, the better. Hopefully people that can come to Covenant who we can serve, families who could benefit from these efforts, and also people who are interested in helping. You know, as Sarah mentioned, one of the things we're most excited about is starting this buddy program, and we need buddies. We need volunteers. Um, Really just volunteering in any capacity with the children's ministry helps to sort of strengthen and build up the infrastructure um, for our children's program, which will only help with our inclusion efforts, but also specifically buddies for our kids who need a little extra support. Um, you know, I think we spoke with a lot of different churches in the area who are really doing a good job with their inclusion ministries. And Dr. Henson Hasty mentioned the vast majority of them are sort of the more evangelical churches in our area. But we're super generous with their time and expertise. And the one of the directors of a program at a large church here in town said, you know, people envision, oh, they think I'm not really equipped to help. I'm not equipped to do this. I'm not an expert. These kids have really complex needs and I don't know what to do. And of course, we earnestly hope and pray that there will be kids with complex needs who are here at church, and we will be prepared for them and we'll have folks ready for them. But for the vast majority of our children, it's going to be, well, I can say from my own experience, the first time my older son did VBS here, um, we were sort of in the diagnostic process with him. I volunteered with a different age group, in large part so I could spy on him at VBS while he was here. Um, but it was still, we were still masking, we were outside, and he's not an eloper, but I were worried about him wandering. That was my thing, was sort of, he doesn't have that instinct of sticking with the group, and especially with having difficulty recognizing faces, he might attach himself to the wrong person or, you know. So I just noted that on his registration form. And around day 2 or 3, it became apparent to me that one of the middle school volunteers, who was maybe 12, this young man, his job was to be sure that every time they moved, that George was with the group. You know, you could sort of see him say, George, and George would tag along and he'd sit with them and he was his buddy. But that's all he did. It was an easy thing for a 12-year-old to do, made a huge difference how I felt. I felt that my son was safe. They were clearly accounting for his needs. But it was really simple. They just needed an extra set of hands to make sure he was around. Um, you know, it could be as simple as just helping someone pre-cut materials for a craft who has challenges with fine motor skills. There really is something that anybody and everybody can do that will genuinely help kids to participate fully. So we really encourage people to spread the word about the buddy program, sign up yourself. We have a training planned for August 27th in the evening. And there's a sign up sheet in the back for anybody who's interested in any additional information. If you're interested in being contacted about the training or just want to talk to us more. Also, some little magnets to encourage you to remember to pray for us and pray for the work that we're doing, and an information sheet as well. We are all happy to talk to you, to give you any additional information. Um, and we would just love for you to participate in any way that you feel you are able or are called.
Thank you. Would y'all join me in thanking our speakers today?
Exciting what y'all are doing.
We will collect some questions now. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask any of these folks, we'll have a chance for that now. I'll start with one. Don will collect those and bring those over, and I'll kind of toss them up, but I'll start with one and open this up to anybody who would like to respond. So one of the things that I'm aware of that the inclusion team did, and Dr. Henson Hasty, I'd be interested to hear your response to this as well. Y'all visited a number of churches to learn and to see what inclusion and belonging looked like in different church settings. Was there a visit that you took or an experience in one of those settings that kind of lingers with you of, gosh, that's what they're doing, what this program is, or how this is working? Um, that stuck with me. Was there a, experience you had that has informed some of the work that you're doing?
Oh, is it on now? Okay, perfect. I think one of the um, things that really stuck with me, and it's one of the kind of phase 3 plans that we have, is providing respite or some support to parents so that they would feel safe to leave their child with a group of people that are trained and be able to do things like go to the grocery store, go out to dinner, go take a nap. And one of the churches talked about how they did that really well. So they had multiple nights throughout the year, and families dropped their children off. There were buddies, they had programming. And I actually think one of the really great things that they did at the end when you picked up is they provided dinner. And so when the families left, they left with a frozen meal and all the plates and everything, so they could just go home after that event, throw that in the oven, and then put their kids to bed. So I think that's one thing that I think really stood out to me as something that is needed. And I know it was in the presentation as well, talking about just respite and support for families and caregivers.
Thank you, Jen.
I'll add one thing. There was we went to lunch at an event called Feast for Friends that happens, I think, once a month or twice a month at Matthews United Methodist Church, that sort of grew up out of a home ministry that a woman who used to be the youth minister at the church started, where she serves really kids of all ages. She does camps for kids of all ages, but throughout the year, adults with disabilities. They have all kinds of programming. I mean, day programming. They have Feast with Friends, where everyone, your waiter is one of the participants in her program. The person who takes your order. You have the people who prepare your food. Um, and we were able to talk to her a little bit. She came over to our table and spoke with us after lunch. And just hearing her story, obviously it's something a little bit different from what we're doing here, but it was just one person who saw a need, and the need is huge. I mean, every church we went to, they said we have people just are coming in droves. Once we have this programming, people really, they're looking for this, they need this. Um, but she saw a need. She really involved her youth group at the beginning. She had all these volunteers who were ready to go she had a really robust youth program. And it was really just sort of one woman with a vision and with the support of her church who's created this really successful ministry that really serves a lot of people and fills a huge need in the community. Jen actually had the ice cream truck. They have, in addition to Feast with Friends, they have an ice cream truck, Treats with Friends, that's available for events. And they just had that at Jen's office, I think, this week. So it's just amazing what, with a little bit of vision and time, the need is there. And as you continue to meet needs and continue to meet needs, you can make a huge impact.
I want to mention a resource. Actually, it's not a church that I visited, but it is the story of a church. I mentioned earlier my comments that following people and where they gather. So the story of this church is called the Disabled Church. It was written by Rebecca Spurrier. She's an associate dean at Columbia. And the church transformed its ministry by really creating different kinds of stations and patterns and rituals and ways to be invited into the community by figuring out where people with disabilities gather. And in that case, it was specifically people experiencing mental illness. That's a very powerful book, and I think could be a really helpful resource. And I also just emphasize, and I put it at the end of my PowerPoint for the inclusivity team or for others that are interested, the work of Eric Carter when he talks about being known. And the whole idea of being known, I didn't elaborate on that, but what he's trying to get at is not having to tell the story of what you need or describe through a kind of medical diagnosis, your own experiences, but just to be understood and known in community and assumed. So it is a video presentation on the church and 10 dimensions of belonging that I think also be really helpful.
Thank you. And if folks want to or need those names of resources, we have the slides, and I'll be glad to share any of the information that you've seen and need to follow up on. I want to ask one more question. This is the work that we're doing at Covenant with inclusion has started with children's ministry, which is a beautiful place to begin. And I hope that's what it is, a beginning. And I'm curious to know, have you had any conversations about how this might trickle up? The church is not all young people. And so what might it look like for the work of the inclusion team to trickle up over the coming years?
Well, I'll speak on that since I am the only one on our panel that has an adult with a disability. Um, Michelle stole my story a minute ago. But that's okay. But in my vision, that is where one of the things that I see our program growing to be is a program for when our children grow up to be adults, that they still have a place where they belong. Our children usually can stay in school till they're about 21 years old when they have a disability. And when they leave school, there is not much for them. 80% of people with disabilities can't find employment. So there is a huge need for them when they are adults to have a place where they feel like they belong, and also that they have a purpose. And I think the church is a great place for us to start. We have to start somewhere, so we have to start with the children's ministry, but also we need to grow with them and support them when they are adults and have a place where we can all be together and belong together.
Thank you. Thank you all. It has been a gift to learn from each and every one of you. Thank you so much. Yes. We'll have to be really quick. I'm going to.
Absolutely. And I'm nodding my head very hard with what you're saying. That's absolutely part of the plan. And I think wanted to get a couple things in place, and then I think the website's undergoing some changes right now. But my background's in marketing, so I'm very much with the intentional marketing and communication of this is kind of half the battle too, like letting people know ahead of time these supports will be there for you. You are understood, you are planned for. I think that's a big part of delivering this ministry is getting the word out. So absolutely, yes.
I love that language of this is a place of expectancy. We're expecting to see you. I think that is so beautiful, and appreciate that being lifted up today. I hope everyone will linger around and maybe grab another cup of coffee or blueberry muffin. I imagine most of the folks up here are willing to stick around and have some conversation or entertain a few additional questions. Let me close us in a word of prayer. Let's pray. Gracious God, we are just thankful. Thank you for gifting us with this time and space to learn and grow in our lives of discipleship through expanding our understanding of the beauty of your creation and the many images of you that we see in one another. Thank you for the faithful work of Dr. Elizabeth Henson Hasty and for the faithful work of our inclusion team. God, we pray that you would sweep us into the work. We know that we would be changed by it. Amen. Well, thank you, friends, for being with us today. I hope you'll join us for worship at 11 o'clock. And just a quick note that next Sunday we'll start our summer Sunday school series, Pathways of Discipleship. And that series will take place in the chapel. So spread the word. It'll be in the chapel, and we hope to see you there. Thank you all for being here. You may go in peace.